Well, I think if I would have had my wish list, I would have said maybe tomorrow issue that Affordable Care Act repeal and replacement bill. But you know what? That's okay. We had I guess we have a very timely topic, and we did make it through a lot of the language of the document last night and this morning. So hopefully what we go through here today will be relevant to everybody, and we'll try to begin to get an understanding of how repeal and replace will impact surgery center employees. Let's see here. There we go. So we're going to take a look at a few things. We're going to look at what the president has said, both candidate Trump and President Trump, what they have said throughout the last 12, 18 months. What Congress has been talking about and what they proposed yesterday, and we're going to analyze all those things in the context of healthcare law and what's been going on. Best guess is that within 1 or 3 month time frame, that's the goal. Congress wants to have this enacted and signed in April, May time frame. So all this could happen quickly. If it doesn't happen that quickly, well, I think then all bets are off. But again, we're going to focus mainly on how surgery centers are impacted by the current repeal and replacement proposal. So candidate Trump talked a lot about getting rid of exchanges, whatever that meant. We're not really sure at the time. Talked about creating or adding to tax-free health savings accounts. Of course, HSAs have been around since 2003, but you know, we want the proposals, I guess, were out there to increase the use of HSAs, make them bigger or better or whatnot. Establishing state-based high-risk pools for people with certain medical conditions. One of the big problems with the Affordable Care Act so far has been the instability of insurance markets. And so high-risk pools, we'll talk more about that, but that's a way to address the instability of the markets. Enabling insurance companies to sell across state lines. There's actually an ability to do that right now, but yet not much of that has happened for various reasons. And again, we'll get into that. And then a populist kind of position is to eliminate the so-called Cadillac tax and also eliminate individual and employer mandates. President Trump then, most recently in the congressional speech last week, started off by saying mandating every American to buy government-approved health insurance was never a good idea. That's a packed statement, obviously. He wants to retain pre-existing condition protections. He wants to ensure a stable transition from where we are now with the Affordable Care Act to where we're going with any replacement law. He wants to include appropriate tax credits that will enable funding of insurance, especially, so that the insurance markets, again, are more stable. Health savings accounts, same as what he said as a candidate. People should be able to buy the plan they want, not what's forced on them. Again, kind of loaded with that government forcing something on us or letting us choose what we want. Give governors more resources and flexibility they need to protect Medicaid. Clearly, the Medicaid issue is a political hot button for a lot of different, in a lot of different ways for a lot of different people. So that's interesting. Legal reforms. Not much has been said about legal reforms in the proposed legislation we received last night. So there's probably more to come on that, but that's been a talking point for President Trump. Bringing down artificially high price of drugs. Again, that's been a platform position, but not much is really addressed in this repeal and replace legislation along those lines. And finally, purchasing health insurance across state lines. So the timing, we think, again, I alluded to this in the beginning, is it could all happen very quickly or all bets are off. But what's set up already is that both houses of Congress have already passed their so-called budget resolution bills for 2017. What that does is it puts in place the mechanism so that the next time they act on, as a full Congress, each house, on this repeal and replace legislation, if it passes, it's right there signed into law. Again, April has been mentioned as a time frame for, especially Paul Ryan from the Speaker of the House. He's mentioned April as a time frame he'd like to see a final vote on the legislation. If that happens, then Trump could sign it into law right away. So a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act can't be done, politically speaking anyway, without budget reconciliation. Reason being, the Senate will, in all likelihood, require 60 votes to pass the Senate. And given that Republicans only have 52 seats, budget reconciliation seems the way to go, because in that mechanism, they only need a majority, 50 plus the vice president, for example. So what can be done in reconciliation? Essentially, that limits any changes to the Affordable Care Act to be focused on federal spending or taxation. But many of the provisions, many of the most unpopular provisions of the Affordable Care Act relate to spending and taxation. So there's actually quite a bit that can be done through this process. The individual and employer mandate provisions are both enforced as a tax, as the Supreme Court ruled a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago. So obviously they're key targets of this process. Subsidies. Right now they're called tax credits. That's how when an individual goes to the individual insurance market, if they're of a certain income level, below a certain income level, they have access to tax credits to help them afford that coverage. That's viewed as a new mandate by conservatives, and they're very unhappy with that. However, now that that mandate is in place, it's very difficult to reverse. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. Things that won't be done through reconciliation, and really probably these are provisions that are very popular, so it's sort of political cover that they can't be done through reconciliation, and that is keeping children on their parents' health plans up until they reach age 26, and also the pre-existing condition issue. Cannot change the rules around pre-existing conditions. In other words, plans must allow people to join the plan without regard to any pre-existing health conditions that they have, and that's not likely to change in the repeal and replace law. So a couple things have already been changed, or at least certain steps have been taken to allow the executive branch of the government to make changes to the Affordable Care Act. Executive order was issued by President Trump on his first day in office on January 20th to minimize unwarranted economic and regulatory burdens of the ACA until repeal and replace can be enacted. We're not really sure what that means, but we do know it gives more leeway to Tom Price as Health and Human Services leader and other departments within the executive branch to make changes to the rules and regulations that govern our health markets. As you may recall, the Affordable Care Act had a lot of provisions in it that said something to the effect of, as shall be decided by the head of Health and Human Services. So the original law gave quite a bit of leeway to the executive branch, and this executive order really ties back to that to allow changes from what's been done. February 15th, President Trump also proposed, there's some rule changes that have to be done through the normal regulatory rule change process, and they've already initiated some of those changes. Those changes primarily were focused on shoring up the individual market, so they don't really relate to surgery center employees so much. But they did talk a little bit about essential health benefit rules, and that is a target of repeal and replace. Finally, if you remember all of the delays and all of the rules issued around delaying implementation of certain aspects of the Affordable Care Act from 2014 up to the present time, one of those is what's impacted is the so-called grandmothered health plans. These are health plans that were put in place after the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, but before the rules around health plans really went into place. The thing about those grandmother health plans is they're somewhat less coverage, so they're less expensive. But a lot of small employers, a lot of small businesses have utilized these grandmothered health plans that are also called non-ACA compliant health plans, because the premium, the monthly premium for these plans is so much less than so-called ACA compliant plans. So finally, again, last night, yesterday afternoon, Congress actually issued their proposed legislation. I would say right off the bat, as I look through that legislation, one of the most striking aspects is the degree to which they are leveling the playing field between self-employed or independent contractor type people and those that work for somebody and work for a company that has offered a health plan. I think that's maybe in the long run one of the bigger impacts for surgery center employees, or rather for surgery center employers, because health benefits has always been a key part of compensation that employers utilize to be attractive to employees, to not only recruit and attract employees to their company, but also to retain employees. Having good health insurance is almost goes hand in hand with wanting to stay where somebody works. So leveling the playing field like this for independent contractors, it'll be interesting to see how that impacts the employment market. Deductibility of insurance for self-employed is going to be treated the same as for employed. That's one aspect. That's huge. Right now, a self-employed person doesn't get the benefit of tax deductibility for the most part for their health insurance. Number two is these refundable tax credits. This is focused on the individual market, but I'm including it as an impact for surgery center employees because of what I've just talked about. How these work is an individual that's, let's say, under 30 years old will be given $2,000 to put toward health insurance in the individual market. If you're a 40-year-old, that's, let's say, $3,000. If you're a 45-year-old or 50-year-old, it's $3,000. If you're over 60, it's $4,000 for that person. If you add in, let's say, employee and spouse, or individual and spouse, for a 50-year-old person, they're going to have $6,000 or $7,000 at their disposal to put toward a health plan. That's roughly equivalent to what a lot of employers right now pay for the employee as the employer portion of the premium. So again, it's kind of leveling that playing field for people that are independent contractors as compared to being an employee. Also, if you don't use that full refundable tax credit, whatever's left over can be put into an HSA. Probably already knows this, kind of goes without saying, the individual mandate and employer mandate rules are eliminated. Basically effective if you're filing your taxes right now. If this law passes, then there will be no penalty for not having coverage in 2016. That's the effective date. eliminates the excise tax on high-cost employer-sponsored health plans. That's the so-called Cadillac tax. Actually doesn't eliminate it, it delays it. Again, it's right now it's delayed, I think, until 2020. It's delaying it another 5 years up to 2025. Back to HSAs, the maximum contribution level for an HSA, and this will certainly affect surgery center employees. Right now the maximum is around $3,000, but if you have a high deductible health plan with a maximum out-of-pocket exposure, you know, what you could ultimately spend out of pocket if you have kind of a quote-unquote bad health year, a lot of times that maximum out-of-pocket exposure might be $6,000, yet you can only put in $3,000 into your HSA. What the proposed law change is that you'll be able to put in an amount that matches your individual max out-of-pocket limit on your health plan, whether that health plan is provided on the individual market or if it's provided in the small group market or even the large group market. Everybody will be allowed to contribute to their HSA up to that out-of-pocket limit. A couple other things is that HSAs, right now, you can't buy aspirin over the counter, an over-the-counter drug, and use your HSA account to pay for that. That's going to change if this law passes. Finally, which makes sense, both spouses can make contributions into a single HSA account, at least for those catch-up contributions. Some other things that will impact surgery center employees, and these are kind of in the weeds, kind of plan design changes that maybe we don't always think very much about, but actually do impact cost quite a bit. Beginning in 2020, the so-called bronze, silver, gold, platinum levels, that'll kind of go away. Instead, I guess the states could pick that up, but what this law is doing is just giving the power, instead of the federal government having the power to decide what's a bronze plan, what's a silver plan, et cetera. These decisions about plan coverage values or amounts are going to be decisions made by the states. There's been word, and this has been a little bit unclear to me, honestly, between the draft bill that we saw in February and what came out last night, eliminating minimal essential coverage rules. I've heard that being talked about as something that's still in the legislation. I have a hard time finding it, honestly. Same with the authority for states to decide coverage mandates. I hear pundits say right now, last night, this morning, that states will get to do that. I'm not quite seeing it that way, the way I read the bill. So to me, that's a question mark. But one thing that for sure is in the bill is it's going to give insurance carriers a little more leeway to make variation in premium levels. They're going based on age. So right now you can only have a maximum of a 3-to-1 difference based on age. That's variations going up to 5-to-1. Finally, this high-risk pools. This is kind of a key part of the bill, I think. This is one of the fundamental changes. They're setting up high-risk pools that, for example, for an individual market or small group market, if there's a person on a plan that incurs a major health event that costs over $50,000 or under $350,000, that this high-risk pool can be tapped into to pay for 75% of those claims. There's a gap in reimbursement along those lines up to $1 million. Kicks back in at up to over $1 million value claim. These high-risk pools will also be tapped into to help pay for those. So these are funds being sent from the federal government directly to the states, and the states will decide how to implement these programs, but they're going to be funded from the federal government. Finally, the tax increase on high-income earners that added to the Medicare tax, that is apparently going to go by the wayside after the end of 2016. So if the legislation passes, that would be basically a tax reduction for high-income earners. So some of the things that we've heard on the other side of the coin, you know, the loyal opposition, maybe we can say. Rand Paul seems to be the spokesperson right now for the conservative side of the aisle, or conservative part of the Republican Party. They're unhappy with these refundable tax credits. Again, it's a new entitlement. That's the way it's viewed, and they're just you know, really not liking that new entitlement. This Cadillac tax, while they're happy with the delay, they would rather not see that in there at all. Also, he made reference early, you know, last week and such, if you watched the news, he made reference to, he didn't like that there was a penalty basically being paid to the insurance carriers. What he was talking about is that if you have a lapse in coverage and then you want to re-enroll, then let's say your lapse in coverage is more than 63 days, then you want to re-enroll, you're going to be charged a 30% premium on your health insurance over and above what you would normally have to pay. The counter argument is that, well, the carrier is actually going to be the one funding claims, you know, for any medical claims that are incurred by that person. So, you know, really they should get the 30% penalty. And oh, by the way, if you have a lapse in coverage and then you're trying to get coverage, it's probably because you're foreseeing some utilization of your health insurance. So I think they're not on as solid a footing on that complaint as some of the others. Also, finally, the conservatives would rather see repeal and then replace. I think they feel they'll have more leverage, especially regarding that refundable tax credit issue. So we'll see how that plays out. So what's next? Over the next 2 to 3 years, you know, nothing. The way the proposed legislation is set up, it delays a lot of the changes to the market to January 1st, 2020, or the way it's worded in the proposal is after December 31st, 2019. So it's going to be 2 or 3 years before much changes really. But so in between that now and then, what will it look like for surgery center employees? I'll go back to these grandmothered plans. We'll have another slide on that coming up here shortly, but these plans, again, they're lower cost than so-called ACA compliant plans, and a lot of small businesses have utilized these plans to keep their premiums lower than they would have been if they would have gotten into the health insurance exchanges. So as an example, one issue with these grandmother plans, however, is that not all states opted to go that direction. In fact, the states that did allow or do allow grandmother plans tend to be, you know, tendency is, or kind of a, when you look at what those states are, they're typically red states. It's interesting. And then the states that do not allow grandmothered plans tend to be the blue states or large states. And it's interesting because the grandmother plans, what it really does, we talked earlier about the risk pools, the federal government funding risk pools. Well, the instability of the insurance market is kind of core to this. Grandmother plans actually make the markets more stable. But if you have a large state like California, huge population, you also probably have a pretty stable market. So it kind of makes sense that a state like California didn't need to allow grandmother plans. Colorado as well, it's known to be a healthy state. So they didn't necessarily need to have a grandmothered health plan allowance. But I think what the red states, you know, they're smaller in population, there are more of them. What they could really benefit from is this interstate sales, interstate insurance sales capability. And we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. back to grandmother plans. Why are they such a huge savings? They are allowed to charge more based on gender or pre-existing condition. They can't deny coverage, but they're allowed to charge more if there are health issues. That's why for right now, for a non-ACA compliant plan, if you're setting up a new plan, the employees will all fill out personal health questionnaires. It's because those plans do take a look at the potential cost based on pre-existing conditions. They don't have to meet the same standards for guaranteed renewability. They don't have to cover some of the essential benefits, such as some prescription drug requirements or maternity care. They don't have to have as much in terms of limit on annual out-of-pocket spending, and they're not required to participate in some of the clinical trials and things like that ACA compliant plans are. Back to interstate, insurance sales and other factors at work. Again, going to these small states, one of the discussion points among the pundits is that we need to find a way for these small states especially to have a large enough market and a diverse enough market where they can mitigate risk of these high cost claimants. On the other hand, this 1945 law, the McCarran-Ferguson Act, actually is the law that was put in place that set up all of these state-by-state health insurance carriers. What that law did is it allowed states to define the rules and all of the mandates and coverage requirements, et cetera. And what that in effect did is really limit competition and set up kind of virtual oligopolies or monopolies inside each individual state. So breaking down those barriers is one of the things that's in discussion right now about, how would we do this interstate insurance sales with the McCarran-Ferguson Act in place? It's kind of difficult. Affordable Care Act Section 1333 is actually something that envisioned interstate insurance compacts. So these are viewed to be regional compacts that would be set up to address this very problem. And finally, the fact that Aetna, Humana, and Cigna, Anthem, those mergers were denied. So I think maybe if you look at maybe those mergers were intended to be by the carriers a way to get sort of a national product line. It's interesting that the federal government now is promoting free markets, so-called, by denying this consolidation. Meanwhile, this McCarran-Ferguson Act is in place, which really limits competition. So it's, they need to decide which direction they're going to go, I think. So you mentioned that these this Section 1333 of the Affordable Care Act allows regional compacts. Soon after the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, 21 state legislatures actually debated laws, and 5 implemented such laws to have interstate sales of their insurance products, and to allow that to happen. However, there aren't any carriers offering these plans right now. So I think that just speaks to still the structural difficulty of doing so. Mentioned this already. I guess I got ahead of myself, but just to put a little bit of an example to it, since 1945 to the present day, there have been 1,900 state mandates put in place by all the states across the country. So, for example, 1/4 of the states require health insurance to cover acupuncture or marriage counseling. Half states require social workers and coverage for social workers, and 60% mandate coverage for contraceptives. 7 states require coverage for hair pieces, and 9 for hearing aids. So you can, just see the complexity of how do you, if you're an insurance carrier selling into multiple states with one plan, virtually impossible to do so. We talked about this, these regional compacts set up by Section 1333. The way those would work is that whatever state they're domiciled in, that's the state that regulates that health plan. But this 1333 would require other states to accept that plan so long as the offering carrier met certain market conduct rules, unfair trade practice rules, had an adequate network, and had consumer protections in place relating to rating and handling of disputed claims. But again, none of these have been put into place so far. So where does that leave us? Trying to make a prediction or try to envision where we might go from here. Again, the law that was proposed yesterday significantly levels the playing field for the self-employed. That is those who access the individual insurance market. By the way, coverage COBRA continuation coverage is also included in this in rules, just like the individual market for this purpose. Premium cost differences between grandmothered plans and ACA compliant plans, I think, paints the light on kind of where the structural problems are with ACA compliant plans. But the initial draft of the bill looks at high risk pools as the primary strategy to address those differences. So, you know, after 2020, if this law goes into place, I would predict that the health plans that are ACA compliant health plans might still be the style of plans available after that if these high risk pools actually work. Big if. Interstate insurance sales may develop, but I think slowly at best. They're very untested. They don't seem to have enough regulatory clarity to be put in place. So again, at best, that's going to be a slow process to set those up. But if Congress fails to pass the bill, you know, again, all bets are off. So what will happen? That probably gives the conservatives, at least in the short run, a little more power to call the shots in terms of what law would be proposed next. You know, I don't know if anybody would predict that the Democrats might, or some moderate Democrats might join up with moderate Republicans, but that seems to be the only third option. And again, that doesn't seem very likely given the day's environment. What to watch in the coming days? You know, number one is, will that refundable tax credit survive? Will, you know, the conservative part of the Republican Party push that out? Or if they try to vote on the bill, will that be the thing that kills the bill? Who knows? Number two is, how will it be scored? We haven't really heard yet what the experts think will happen to the number of people that will lose or gain coverage. You're not reading a lot in the newspapers today that a bunch of people will gain coverage. So probably going to read about how many people will lose coverage. Also, the cost to the federal government. Budget reconciliation actually says you have to have a net zero cost. But we all know games are played with that analysis. So we'll see how much really how much really this bill is going to cost, or this repeal and replace effort will cost. People to watch: Mick Mulvaney is a Tea Party Republican that just joined the Trump administration. He came from Congress. He's now the director of White House Budget Office. Thought is that he can sway those conservatives in the Republican side, and perhaps help usher this bill through to approval. In the House of Representatives, especially the Ways and Means Committee and Energy and Commerce, those are the two committees that are really writing the bill. Rand Paul, again, is the voice of the opposition right now. And we'll all see how the leadership handles this. President Trump, Speaker Paul Ryan, and Senate Leader Mitch McConnell. So that's maybe the 30,000 foot view of things from my perspective. Hope that was informative, but I think now it's time to open up for any questions. Yeah, that's a great question, but it does seem like this proposed law change does maybe make that less scary for employees. So maybe again, this is all speculation, but maybe the incentives are such that there's not as much of a need. It's a big cost for surgery centers. So we'll see where that goes. But that subsidy, the refundable tax credit, is the key provision, and the deductibility of health insurance costs for self-employed people, or people who access coverage through the individual market. There's really a better way to say it. You can be employed by somebody who doesn't sponsor a health plan. Go to the individual market, and if this bill becomes law after 2020, you'll be able to deduct health insurance cost from your individual tax return. I think the primary advantage to selling policies across state lines in the short run would be a more stable market, and that seems to be the problem with the insurance exchanges as they are right now. They just don't have enough population to spread risk of high cost claimants. And in the long run, in the medium and long run, maybe some carriers will be really innovative about the types of products they offer. Maybe customer service will improve, all those sorts of things, greater competition. But in the short run, if they come about at all, it seems to be just a more stable market, especially in those states that don't have as big a population as other states. It looks like the bill that was leaked back in February, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, seemed to indicate that the grandmothered health plans would be allowed, in which case out-of-pocket costs, I think if I look at that, you'd think they tend to go up, the out-of-pocket costs. But the way I read the bill this morning, it looks to me like the coverage, the out-of-pocket cost-sharing amounts are still protected. In other words, the federal government put in, with the Affordable Care Act, limited the amount of out-of-pocket costs that a subscriber would have to incur. You have, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. So, the bronze obviously has a much bigger out-of-pocket than the platinum, but you knew what you're getting into. Versus grandmothered plans, these non-compliant plans, you didn't really know what your out-of-pocket exposure truly was. However, with the bill last night, proposed bill last night, this morning, when you read through it, it looks like they're maintaining those protections. Yeah, again, the main difference is the grandmother plans don't have to follow a lot of the same coverage rules, underwriting rules, those sorts of things. So they are allowed to adjust premium cost based on adjusting the plan design itself. And whereas the ACA compliant plans, they delineate specific requirements. Grandfathered plans is a whole different thing. That kind of goes back to before the law was passed, and maybe large employers still have grandfathered plans. These are plans that are in place back before 2010, and if there have been virtually no changes to that plan, and the employer and the carrier or third-party administrator of that plan agree to maintain that plan, they can maintain that plan. And that doesn't really change, so far as I can tell. But that's a little bit different than the grandmother plans.